Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to the monthly Transit Choices meeting. It's our pleasure to have you with us today. It is my pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker, Sean Winkler. Sean is the Senior Policy Advisor, Transportation Equity Engagement with the Maryland Department of Transportation. His presentation is titled Workgroup on the Reorganization of the Maryland Transit Administration, 2025 Work Session and Report Findings. The work group on the reorganization of the Maryland Transit Administration was established by HB or House Bill 517 to study the potential of the reorganizing the Maryland Department of Transportation, MDOT, and MTA. The work group comprises legislators, representatives from regional government bodies, MDOT, MTA, and MTA riders. Mr. Winkler will discuss his role providing staff support to the work group and its findings from its 2025 work session. Welcome, Sean. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Robin, and good morning, everyone. Give me just a second to see if we can see slides here. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Thank you very much. So as Robin mentioned, I'm Sean Winkler. I serve as a policy advisor here at MDOT. I had the pleasure of providing MDOT staffing for this work group. We put out our first report at the end of December and wanted to, at Transit Choices request, kind of provide an overview of the work that we undertook the last year, as well as highlight some of the findings. So as Robin mentioned, this work group was established to kind of study potential reorganization plans at MTA, identify costs and benefits of potential reorganizations, contractual obligations, federal requirements, and kind of identify potential steps to transfer duties or do a reorganization. The bill was very specific in one approach, though it was kind of broader in reorganization writ large. But one prescriptive consideration was this idea of potentially establishing a statewide MTA unit, potentially housed at the Secretary's office where I work, and then a Baltimore-specific MTA, which would ensure Baltimore City has appropriate oversight and input of. Outside of that very specific reorganization plan, the legislation was pretty neutral and pretty broad in kind of studying potential reorganizations. There were two reporting deadlines. This is one of the fun parts of Annapolis as well as Washington, D.C., if you enjoy legislation like me. But we initially had two reporting deadlines. I'll work backwards. But the authorizing legislation itself, the HB 517, had a reporting deadline of December 2026. But the budget bill that contains all of our money had a different reporting deadline and also had a hold on some of our operating funds to deliver a report by 2025. That helps ensure we move quickly. And then the work group, which I'll get into, as Robin mentioned, was comprised of a bunch of different folks. We had representatives from the authorizing committees as well as the funding committees in the House and Senate for transportation matters, the Secretary and the MTA Administrator. We had the BRTC as well as the local MPO, which is the regional planning body federally required for the Baltimore region, and then two MTA riders that were appointed by the governor. And then Samir Sid served as the chair of the work group. And it was jointly staffed by me at MDOT as well as my colleagues in the Department of Legislative Services, as well as the House and Environment Transportation Committee in the House. It was a rapid fall of meetings. I'm going to start with encouraging folks, if you're unfamiliar with the work group, please do check out our website. There really are some amazing presentations on all of these topics that you see here listed, from MTA's workforce to MTA's federal funding requirements to potential national, transit governance and funding considerations, as well as local, reports, given that others have kind of studied the governance reform idea with MTA for almost a decade at this point. But really some wonderful materials here. But we did our best to kind of provide, a high level overview to start, and then really kind of dove in from there on kind of what we considered were the statutory requirements of the bill, the workforce considerations, the contracts, what would change with our federal requirements if we were to do a reorganization. And then meeting 4 and 5 really kind of dived in a lot more in detail on potential reorganization concepts and plans. But to kind of guide our work, our chairman, Mr. Sid, guided the work group to kind of come up with some problem statements on what exactly this legislation was seeking to solve so that we could kind of work from there, all united around, a similar problem set. The first problem set was really around kind of creating greater local control of the Baltimore region's transit system. I think a lot of the members on the work group really referenced the 2015 Red Line decision really as the emphasis for this problem statement, and having a greater check on some state decision making that can have impacts to this region's transit system. And then the second problem statement was kind of a general improvement of MARC services, with a particular emphasis on some of MARC's peers, especially systems like VRE to our south, SEPTA to our north, but really a goal of, enhancing MARC services. Okay. Um, So in December, we came out with a report, and if you take a peek at the kind of last meeting slides, you can kind of check through some of these findings, but I'll tick them off here at a high level. The work group, acknowledged that MTA governance reform would enhance transparency and collaboration in decision making. They also found that separating two modes would not support the state's goals at this time. I'll spend a little more time on that just for a second. But I will say at MDOT right now, we've certainly seen a lot of impact with a changed federal administration when it comes to approvals or even basic funding agreements for our money. So I think the work group identified that if we were to perhaps create two modes or two entities, that would be putting a lot of decisions on Washington to accept. And I think that was certainly part of the reason for that funding. At the fourth meeting, we heard from our friends at the American Public Transit Association, and they gave, I thought, a wonderful presentation on kind of transit and governance and funding across the country. And one of the things they mentioned to the work group was that oftentimes governance reform is tied to funding. If there is kind of a greater power sharing between state and local or regional and local, that type of governance reform and power sharing does typically come with revenue. However, based on the legislation, the work group acknowledged that, while revenue is hugely important, it was outside of the purview of this work group, which was much more specific to reorganization and governance. They also found, and this is what I'll spend the meat of the time talking through, that the creation of an MTA board of directors for the Baltimore core services and an advisory board for commuter services would also be in the interest of the state. I think that was the primary finding of this report, and the vast majority of my next slides will be on that. But of course, too, and especially as we're approaching the legislative session that's kicked off as of yesterday, there's also several initiatives that would, enhance MTA operations and services today that the work group acknowledged, and we certainly appreciate their acknowledgement of some of our legislative initiatives and ask over the last several years. These would include potential additional delegated procurement authorities to MTA, quick take authority, which is kind of a property thing. Happy to take questions on that, as well as tort reform, which also happy to take questions there later. But we really appreciated the inclusion of some of these legislative priorities that, we strongly believe would enhance MTA's operations and ability to deliver service. And then lastly, another key finding was the report recommended we undertake a study to kind of explore the creation of a rail authority, TBD on what that looks like, but just wanted to acknowledge the finding. Okay, so wanted to spend some time on that primary finding, which was this two-board model, which certainly dominated the last two meetings of the work group. But the idea would be kind of two boards. The Baltimore Core Service Board would kind of oversee core service, for lack of a better word, light rail, bus, metro, really the core service in the Baltimore region. While this Commuter Services Board would oversee MARC as well as kind of commuter services in the state, mainly commuter bus, but to kind of house those services together. The commuter board is intended to be more advisory. I think what was proposed, and we'll get into, was kind of an idea of creating a BRTC type body for MARC, while the Baltimore board is imagined as having more authorities and duties than just being an advisory board, which we'll get into. So general composition, I wanted to start here with both boards, but the work group found that appointments on this board would be shared between the governor and the core service jurisdictions, which I think is really a big deal, especially when you consider that first problem statement on the greater local oversight. I think that is certainly a direct response to that. However, the governor would maintain a majority of the seats and ultimately name the chair. But certainly at MDOT, for example, we also covered some of the boards we have existing to date. To my knowledge, this would certainly be the first board at MDOT that has that local jurisdiction, shared appointment and power. Of the appointees, they should be a mix of riders, residents, representatives for riders with accessibility challenges, and representatives from anchor institutions in the region. We had an open question that will be explored during the legislative session in consultation with the Office of Attorney General, but a potential role to be determined for labor to be on the board, but certainly some questions to work through there as well, given some of the matters the boards may consider. Thought would be terms would be staggered, but the governor could name a chair at any time. MDOT secretary and administrator would serve as ex officio non-voting members. That would also be unique for our boards that exist at MDOT, for us to kind of have more of an ex officio role. And there was a lot of discussion on the creation or a reorganization around a deputy CEO or some type of director generally for the Baltimore Core Services territory. And the idea of that position would be created to support the work of this board, and these boards would be housed at MTA and staff would be provided by MTA MDOT. So for duties, the first is pretty general, but a general acknowledgement of approval of major service plans and policies, very standard board stuff. General assumption that these duties would include the assumption of the BRTC's duties as well. I think the work group acknowledged potentially having two bodies is probably a little duplicative there. So that will be an interesting thing to watch moving forward. Providing advice and guidance on this deputy CEO position, which I just mentioned. Again, the idea of that position would be kind of supporting the board and reporting to the MTA administrator. Review and approval authority of MTA's capital and operating budget requests for the region. That would be an expansion of the current power BRTC has there, which is a kind of review and comment power. But I think there was a lot of discussion on the work group of, having a formal resolution kind of acknowledging, the real ambitions and potential needs of the region. These budget requests would ultimately be non-binding. We certainly here at MDOT have to ensure that the solvency of the TTF, and certainly have had to make some really tough decisions given the larger financial situation the state is in. But I think the real thought there is, a stamp of approval that would allow, stakeholders and advocates and folks to kind of unite around that and push, which we certainly have appreciated. The last session with the $400 million revenue package that I know many on this call were supportive of. And of course, we would need time, a timeline would have to be established for those because we have a lot of fast and frequent deadlines when it comes to CTP development and budget requests that don't just involve MDOT, they involve DBM, Department of Budget and Management, and many of our colleagues to, ensure, we're aware of what is a $66 billion general fund budget and a independent TTF as well. This one is another response, I think, to the problem statement, but the board would have approval authority over a decision to withdraw a New Starts Capital Invest grant for any BCS territory project once it has entered into the engineering phase as determined by FTA. So I think that is certainly a direct response to the 2015 red line decision. This position, I think, does its best to balance the needs of the state here. Ultimately, in the current model, the state provides all the funding at this point, while still acknowledging the region's control and desire to kind of see oversight and prevent decisions like the red line from occurring. Of course, that doesn't preclude if there is a financial disaster in the state, or a case to be made that there are, non-nefarious withdrawal reasons, but it would provide a check on that. And the engineering phase, I think, requires 30% of the state local match to have been committed to the project at that point. So that is kind of the thought from the work group on kind of balancing state and local needs and governments there. And then, of course, an annual report to the General Assembly. Moving to the Commuter Services Board, given that this one is advisory in nature, these appointments would be solely from the governor. However, they would be reflective of the MARC and commuter bus service territories, riders with accessibility challenges, etc. I think the real intent here is for, residents and folks from the state that, use the MARC service or live near it to be involved on this board. MTA does have rider advisory groups like this already, but I think the thought here would be kind of an enhancement of that. Similar question on the labor, which we'll be resolving and discussing with our Office of Attorney General. Similar roles, with the governor naming the chair and the term staggered, unlike the other board. MDOT would be a voting member on this one. And similar thought on this creation of a deputy CEO position to kind of support the board's work and respond to them. You'll see here these powers, if you're familiar with BRTC, are closer to that. Advice and guidance regarding commuter services, plans and policy approvals, etc. Same power on this advice and guidance of the Commuter Services Deputy CEO. And then similar process to the CTP, but it is a review and comment power here as opposed to a review and approve. And then this, same annual report to the General Assembly as well. So next steps, and I look forward to your questions. But the work group did acknowledge in the last meeting that the sponsor of the legislation acknowledged that substantial work had been occurring from August to November. I can certainly speak to that. It was an absolute sprint to put on a meeting every 3 weeks to 2.5 weeks on some pretty heavy topics. So certainly appreciate that acknowledgement. And also acknowledging that the work group had reached consensus on these findings. So, the assumption is there may be a legislative initiative on this session, but the work group does not plan to meet in 2026 because they felt that their statutory objectives had been accomplished in, 3 months. But legislative activity is expected. And with that, I will stop there and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sean. That's great. If you have a question, comment, or would like to provide feedback, you may either raise your hand or put a message in the chat. So we will start with Danny.
Hey, Sean, good morning. Thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask, you had one point in on one of the slides about transit governance is often tied to new measures to increase revenue, or something kind of along those lines. And so I wanted to ask, like, are you kind of saying here that this structure would need to include, some work from the state legislature to identify new revenue sources or revenue generating measures to make this happen? Or would this kind of two-pronged, we have the Baltimore core uh, group and the commuter advisory group, like those can exist without, identifying new revenue generating sources?
Thanks, Danny, and good morning. I think that finding was certainly an acknowledgement of the presentation we saw from APTA, and that, in the vast majority of governance reform, regarding transit agencies across the United States, that reform is generally tied to revenue, and that source is neutral. It could be a local source, could be a state source, could be a regional source. But, I think the work group at least wanted to acknowledge that, these things tend to be married together. It's pretty rare and I think unique that one moves without the other. And, our work group acknowledged that we're a unique state here in Maryland, and we're not going to hit pause on, potential governance reform because folks thought the impact of that, outweighed waiting for a larger revenue question to be solved, but wanted to at least acknowledge it.
Got it. Thanks. Appreciate that.
Jimmy, did you have your hand up?
Yes, but the question I was going to ask is exactly what the previous question was. So I took it back down.
Okay. We have a question from Tulu. How does HB 517's two-board setup fix Baltimore's transit issues without hurting statewide funding fairness?
Well, that's a loaded one, Tolu. I think most of this stuff right now is speculative, but we did come together as a work group to put out these recommendations. I think there's going to be, a lot of things to work out in the implementation of this. But I think, in my mind, those questions are largely avoided in the fact that we are not creating two modes here. I think if we were potentially being asked to kind of create a statewide mode and a Baltimore only mode, I think those conflicts would be more prominent, just given the way our capital funding and things work. You'd potentially have another kind of direct competitor there.
Jimmy?
Yeah. I put my hand back up.
Okay.
I just want to make two comments, really, not questions. As we've been working for a dozen years to improve Baltimore's transit system, this 517 work group has taken the most important step to actually improving Baltimore's transit system, because in creating a separate core commission, it gives Baltimore the ability to lobby on the CTP and bring together businesses, elected officials, advocates to create a budget for the Baltimore regional area, and then exactly what WMATA does for Washington. And because the MTA was a state agency which ran the Baltimore transit system, we've never had that ability to lobby for additional funding for the Baltimore region specifically. And so this is a huge step forward. And then, as Daniel was saying, it also is on the verge of taking the next step, which is to create regional funding for a regional transit system, in addition to what funding we receive from the state. So those two things are going to be extremely important to the future of being able not only to maintain what we have, which we're doing, but also to expand the services. We need funding. We need revenue to expand. And this is a huge step forward. I just want to make those points.
Thank you, Jimmy. We have a message in the chat from Will. For the Core Services Board, the language review and approve seems actually to be simply advise. So why the language approve?
The BRTC's, statutes and powers is review and comment. I'm not an English major, but review and approve certainly seems stronger to me than review and comment. I think the fact that there would be a formal vote at a board that would, provide that kind of level, of endorsement, especially considering MDOT and MTA administrators are ex officio non-voting members on that board. I think that puts a stamp potentially on a budget request that, to be frank, is outside of our current process. And I personally think that's quite a change.
Thank you, Sean. We'll conclude this segment of the agenda with a question that Transit Choices receives fairly often, which is, what is the difference between the work or the purview of the 517 work group and the BRTA? And more specifically, what is the BRTA sort of charged with moving forward in 2026?
You would have to explain to me what the BRTA is, Robin.
The Baltimore Regional Transit, I'm sorry, BRTC, the Baltimore Regional Transit Commission.
The BRTC exists today. We are looking forward to our meeting with them, I think next Friday, coming up here quickly.
Right.
The report here recommended potentially that the duties of the BRTC, be transferred to the new Baltimore board. This is all speculation on what this may look like, but that was the recommendation in this report.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Sean, for spending part of your day with us this morning and for your excellent presentation. We will be sure to share your slide deck with the meeting participants later today. So thank you again. It is my pleasure to now introduce Jake Schutt. Jake is a transportation planner and policy analyst with the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. His presentation is titled From Commission to Community, the BRTC newsletter as a transit tool. And Jake is going to be presenting an overview of the new BRTC newsletter. It is a monthly publication that shares clear, timely updates on transit projects, commission actions, regional policy, and ways to get involved across Central Maryland. The presentation will highlight how the newsletter took shape, the types of content it focuses on, and why partnerships with groups like Transit Choices are key to growing its audience and strengthening transit advocacy in the region. Welcome, Jake. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be presenting at Transit Choices. Thanks for inviting me. In any case, I did pop a couple references, links into the chat at the top of the chat before the questions if you feel like referencing during the presentation, just enriching a little bit. But in any case, yes, I am from the Baltimore Regional Transit Commission. We work out of the Baltimore Metropolitan Council offices. I assume this audience has the high level, but they know what we are. We were created by the General Assembly back in 2023, really got rolling in 2024 once we got fully staffed and started having our meetings and had all of our commissioners appointed. The enabling statute created a number of statutory responsibilities that we do that have to do with advocacy and oversight to give the Baltimore region a voice that was kind of previously lacking and kind of unique in the way that we didn't really have a regional voice for a metro of our size. This is an extremely high level overview. I have a 10-minute presentation. I could easily spend 10 minutes on the various statutory requirements, but what I'm here to talk about today is some of the things that we're kind of going above and beyond those on the BRTC and maybe kind of looking to expand our audience and reach to maybe more general public and transit advocates rather than kind of based on more government to government communications and interactions. And the two of those specifically are the monthly newsletter that we launched in November 2025. We just put out our third edition here on Monday of this week. And this is an add-on to the presentation because things move fast, is that we are kind of launching a BRTC 2026 transit funding priorities campaign. Another way that we're kind of trying to build coalitions and kind of spread information beyond just the policy wonks and the insiders. So the newsletter's been under development. I started about last spring on this, and a lot of refinements, thinking about kind of the format and the content and kind of the schedule of it, how we're going to produce it. And I have to thank my vital collaborators, that being the other BRTC staff, really great guidance from the BRTC commissioners, a lot of help from the Baltimore Metropolitan Council's communications team to really refine a lot of this stuff, and some great advice from them. Working with the transit advocacy organizations in particular, we had some great meetings with both Transit Choices and CMTA to kind of bounce off some of the content we were thinking about, kind of get some reactions from them, and really generate some great ideas, as well as opening the lines of communication so we could kind of be spreading the word what these organizations were doing, the vital work they do. Likewise, we met with a number of the transit providers in the region to do the same sort of thing, just kind of show them the content, see what they thought, get some more additional ideas, and really make sure to get the communication lines open so we could also be spreading the news on the great things that our transit providers are doing here in town. From the beginning, thinking about the target audiences for this publication, and really the smallest but important subset was the BRTC commissioners, to keep them appraised of the internal news of the commission, but also in addition sharing all kinds of the monthly important news with them, some of which gets covered at our bi-monthly meetings that helps them do their job and be decision makers. Also looking to network across jurisdictions with the regional transportation professionals and spread the word about what's happening in different jurisdictions. Really looking to reach out to the transit advocates, both the formal type like we have here at Transit Choices, but also just generally the boosters of transit in town who, whether they ride or not, understand the importance of transit in Baltimore and why it is so vital to fund and support. Elected officials, of course, were a big target audience and built an extensive mailing list of officials at the local and state level primarily. Regional press too, to spread some of these stories and maybe get even more news and perspective about the regional transit system in the press. So built a big mailing list that covered everything from web to print to TV to radio, primarily regional, but then also looking at some of the focused national outlets like Mass Transit Magazine, Metro Magazine, things along those lines. And really trying to enlarge the audience more into the general public to make people aware of all the important things going on in the regional transit system. And we're certainly always looking to work with our partners to kind of build the audience, get more attention for the newsletter, get it in front of more people's eyes. So anything people can do to share the newsletter on social media, forward it to their mailing list, or just give us ideas where they think there'd be opportunities for us to build audience. It's a fairly brief newsletter, so it doesn't take too long to read, but it does hit on a good array of information. And I don't have time in the length of the presentation to go over all the kind of content that we have here, but really some of the core content that I want to focus on is the commission news section is very important, which we cover things about what the BRT sort of releases and deliverables, like the Transit Fund and Priorities campaign that we'll be talking about in a minute. But also when the legislative report came out in December, giving a link to access to that, our comment letter on the draft consolidated transportation program, so people can kind of get into how we saw that and what really requires vital funding. Engagement opportunities is a very important thing that we like to highlight whenever possible. And three different kind of examples of what we try to hit on, whether we're talking about the in-person meetings that happen traditionally at a time and a place, all the online opportunities to be able to, for people to make their voice heard about things that are relevant to the Baltimore regional transit system. And then also doing things that kind of reporting on engagement results. Like in this case, we reported on the transit choices survey that came out, and just sort of a high level of what some of the major findings were, and then just giving access to people who kind of wanted to dig in more, because to let people know that these engagements does have impact, and what kind of impact and what sort of findings there are, I think engages people as a positive loop to participate in engagement. Legislative roundup is a very important, and this is one of those areas of creativity that actually came out of our meeting with Transit Choices and was Robin's idea. Kind of intuitive, but we didn't think of that one offhand, and very important that we did. Anything that's happening at any level of government that's impactful to the regional transit system, certainly the HB 517 work group was covered as it was moving through, and will continue to be. Definitely once we get to more into the General Assembly session, impactful things going on in there, we'll try to be covering as makes sense with their monthly frequency. Transit provider news is very important to cover, like fun stories, like last month when the MTA had some new holiday sweaters, and directing people to their merch store if they want to show their enthusiasm with transit in fashion. Also things that are like when the Charm City Circulator expanded. So, really anything to kind of feature like large scale hiring events, major fleet additions, major funding awards, maybe large new facilities open. Certainly the MTA, as the largest transit system in the region, gets a fair amount of press, but we also want to get some word out about some of the great things that are happening at the locally operated transit systems in the region. And then moving on to the newer thing that we've come up with is the BRTC 2026 funding priorities informational campaign, and it really takes two different parts. One is a flyer that we've designed that we're going to try to get around to Annapolis and in the right hands, and maybe some other outlets and just general public. And on the front side, we really have the three important takeaway messages: that transit is just vital to our community, that the MTA bus network in particular is such a workhorse as far as getting ridership, and that we're a little bit different than, say, Wilmata, that's more metro based, and that we really have great transit plans. But these great ideas don't come to fruition without the funding that could really have major impacts on mobility in the Baltimore region. And on the back side of the flyer, we go into identifying really some of the critical investments about Be More Bus and some of the facilities besides just the vehicles it needs. Also thinking about the clear line path for the red line to finally realize that important east-west corridor, both the planning and securing the funding, and really talking about reliable rails and buses and the associated infrastructure for them. We've had a lot of great positive developments as far as state of good repair for both the light rail and the metro, as a lot of us were at the Metro Rail Car event last week. But to really just keep in mind that we can't let state of good repair kind of slip and let ourselves get into a hole with that sort of stuff that we have to dig out of. And then specific asks from our state representatives as the session continues, the robust capital funding to really, kick off the important ideas and these really great transit plans that we have. But of course, thinking about keeping the operations funding strong to keep the new services and the current services that we have reliable and long lasting, and the kind of thing that builds ridership if people don't see delays and cancellations. And to really think about prioritizing the high impact investments, certainly light rail modernization, the red line, and really the Be More Bus plan in particular, which just has so much bang for the buck with the importance of the bus system in the region. And we also have a supporting website then that people can go to. Oh, there's a QR code on the back of the flyer that then points people easily to the website that we have. And we're also trying to publicize in other ways. Really echoes a lot of the same information that we have on the flyer, but then goes into a little bit more depth and beyond. We have again, repeating what we're asking of our decision makers to really consider if they do care, if they are serious about the transit system here in Baltimore. Also, some very direct calls to action to people that are at the elected level, but also the advocates and community members, and things they can do like sharing the materials, forwarding the website around, maybe printing up the flyer, really relying on some of the succinct talking points to kind of make the case whether they are trying to communicate with their elected officials or just friends, loved ones, and community members about why the transit system is important that sometimes gets overlooked. And then finally, for the people who want to dive in a little bit deeper, kind of the website ends with some more in-depth information, a couple of the BRTC kind of position letters that make the case for more transit funding, as well as things like the draft CTP that next week, once we have the final, we'll be putting that up for access and giving people easy access to some of the really important transit plans that we celebrate and want people to get to know a little bit more and what could be done if they actually do get the funding and support that they deserve. And with that, I'm guessing I'm roughly at about my time. I will trust you to keep the meeting on schedule, Robin, but if there is any time for any questions or comments, I'm here to take them.
Sure. Thank you, Jake. If you would kindly go back to the full screen, that would be great, just so I can see.
Oh, I'm not on full screen now?
If you just take down your slide presentation.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Please.
Yep.
That would be
Figure out how to
great.
do that. No, not that. Okay. Is it 5 again? Sorry. I think I got it. How do I unshare? I'll figure this out. Keep talking.
That's fine. Yeah, not a problem whatsoever. Let me just see if anyone's raised their hand. Hold on.
All right.
I usually hit escape, but I'm certainly not tech savvy, so don't go by me.
All right.
You'll figure it out. I don't see any hands raised, but what I would like to do, Jake, is to thank you so much for taking on this really important new project. Transit Choices we were delighted that you reached out and we had a really productive conversation about potential content for the newsletter. So we think that is really important. And lastly, information exchange, the sharing of knowledge is critical because it sort of, to us, it results in improved outcomes, it drives progress, and all of us within the transit advocacy arena are all trying very, very hard to collaborate and work together on moving the transportation agenda forward. And what you've done with this newsletter is really important in terms of having one place consolidated to really be updated on what's going on and how we can get involved. So great job, Jake, and thank you so much for being with us today. Jimmy, you have a question or comment?
Yeah. It's so in our 12 years of advocacy for better transit, one of the things that's been impressed upon us was how many great people were working at Baltimore Metropolitan Council, MTA, MDOT, and really working hard to improve transit, but that the public was unaware of what was going on. And because, the people in the different bureaucracies realize the shortcomings of the system, the unreliability, the lack of frequency. And they were working very hard to improve things, but they had limited budget, limited funding. But the public was not aware of how hard these people work and what great ideas they were promoting. And Jake's creation of this newsletter is so important to communicate with the public what's going on in the transit bureaucracy. It isn't dormant. They're not a bunch of sleeping bureaucrats. They're very hardworking people, and I'm so glad to have this letter, Jake. I'm so glad you're doing this. So thank you.
You're welcome, Jimmy. Thank you very much. Kind words.
Wonderful. It is now my pleasure to introduce Paul Sturm. Paul is the campaign manager of Better Transit Now and the chair of the Downtown Residents Advocacy Network. Paul's presentation is titled The Major League Transit Rally and Advocacy Day at the Maryland State House, February 2nd. And Paul is going to preview the plans for the day and talk about how the Baltimore region transit supporters can participate. Welcome, Paul. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Robin, and good morning, fellow transit advocates. I'm assuming we're all transit advocates, at least I hope we are. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, and Jake, you're my backup, so I am going to try to share. Oh, okay, you've already got my slides up. Okay, so I don't even need to share my screen. So Jake, thank you, and I'll let you know, when to move on. So as Robin said, we have what we're calling the Major League Transit Rally and Advocacy Day at the Maryland State House on Lawyers Mall, February 2nd. Next slide, Jake. Jake? Oh, there we go. So some of you are probably wondering why we're calling this the Major League Transit Rally. We're calling it that because, as we all know, Baltimore has Major League Baseball and NFL football, but we only have minor league transit. Next slide. Therefore, the Baltimore region needs Major League transit now. And Robin, as you look at the slide there, I think you might recognize the photo on the right.
Yes.
As a former Bostonian, you probably know that's Commonwealth Avenue and the green line that runs up and down and serves a lot of people and institutions in the Boston region. And the reason we're framing it this way is that we have Major League Baseball, NFL football, because the state of Maryland has made tremendous investments at our two major league sports franchises, building the two stadiums a number of years ago, but more recently, 3 sessions ago, the legislature found $1.2 billion for the Orioles and the Ravens to upgrade their two ballparks and their two stadiums. And when you combine the usage of those stadiums, they're used fewer than 100 days a year. On the other hand, people rely on and use public transportation in the Baltimore region how many days a year? 365 days a year. So if the Ravens and the Orioles and those two stadiums, merit $1.2 billion from the state of Maryland, we believe the tens and ultimately hundreds of thousands of Baltimore residents and institutions and businesses, et cetera, that rely on transit merit at least that level of investment as we go forward. Next slide. Okay, so 1 year ago, our campaign organized the first ever Transit Riders Rally at the state capitol. We had 120 transit riders and supporters turn out for the very first time. And we thought it was so important to identify and really highlight the engagement, the involvement of transit riders at this rally and doing the related advocacy, because up until then, transit riders have been pretty invisible at the State House, at the state capitol during session. We, and I'm one of them, have been voiceless, faceless, just really not on the radar screen. So we wanted to change that, and we got a tremendous response, as you can see. Next slide, please, Jake. Okay. Even before the rally, we're able to have a delegation of Baltimore City public school students meet with the governor and the lieutenant governor. And we thought that meeting was really important because it gave the governor and lieutenant governor a chance to hear firsthand the stories from these young people who want to do nothing more than get to class on time, participate in after school activities, and get home before it's dark. And I would tell you, I was in the room, I was right across from the governor, lieutenant governor. They were moved. They heard stories that they had not heard before about the difficulty, the anxiety, and even it's, to some degree, the trauma that these students, our future, go through every day just to get to school, just to get to class on time and back home in the evening. And we all know, as we've heard before, that the legislature, with the governor's support, found $400 million of new money for MTA this past session. But I want to believe that because of what the governor heard during that meeting, he and his staff worked as hard as they could to help get that money through the legislature. I know many of us were involved in the MOVE coalition that the governor's office was, governor's staff was, thank you, Will, was engaged in. So we think those kids, those young people, really, really help make a difference. Next slide. So at the rally, we had a number of speakers. Our kickoff speaker was Hallie Arnold, and we're really delighted that she was willing to kick it off. She was able to speak on behalf of MTA and talk about the importance of a much greater investment in our public transportation system. I don't know if Hallie's on this call or not, but if she is, thank you. And again, I know her comments were very well received and appreciated by the group there. Next slide, Jake. We also had a number of members of the General Assembly speak. Senator McCray, Corey McCray, who has been one of the leading and most passionate advocates for better transit and more investment. And I could tell you, Corey really got the crowd fired up. So we appreciate that. Next slide, Jake. Okay, we had, as you can see as well, Senator Shelley Hendelman, Delegate Sheila Ruth. And it was really important to have those two speaking because they represent not Baltimore City, but Baltimore County, because this is a regional need. It's not just Baltimore City that needs better transportation. It's Baltimore County and the entire region that needs it. So we really appreciate their turning out and speaking to the crowd. Next slide, Jake. Okay. We also had, of course, a lot of grassroots participation and speakers at the rally. To the left, you'll see Jordan Jones, a teacher in the Baltimore City public school system. Jordan has an interesting story. He grew up in Baltimore, played professional basketball in Europe. And then when he came back to Baltimore, he said, something isn't right here. Wherever I played in Europe, I could take public transportation, reliable transportation to my practices, to the arenas where we were playing, just to get around town. Come back to Baltimore, and it's not that way. So he brought that perspective and that story to the rally. And to the right, you'll see Bemi Bird, who until recently was with the No Boundaries Coalition, coalition of 7 neighborhood organizations in West Baltimore. And I hope I'm not saying anything I should be at this point, but Bemi, just in the past week, has moved on, and she is now working for one of our state senators, Senator Antonio Hayes. So first of all, I don't know if Bemi's on this call or not, but if she is, congratulations, Bemi. But she left behind a real core of supporters at the No Boundaries Coalition. In fact, I was with them just 2 nights ago, and they will again be sending a lot of their neighborhood residents who use transit every single day to our next rally, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So next slide, Jake. Okay, we also got great media coverage. I saw Danny Zawadny on the call. Thank you, Danny, for the banner story. It wasn't just the banner, it was the Baltimore Sun who covered the rally and wrote about it. WYPR, our public radio station here in Baltimore, interviewed myself and Bemi Boer, put a wonderful story up on their website. You know, we couldn't have scripted a better headline. Marylanders demand better transit now. So we're hoping for, Danny, if you're still with us, we're hoping for similar coverage of the Major League Transit Rally in the next month. Next slide, Jake. Okay, and this is important to keep in mind, and this speaks to what Jake mentioned earlier, and Sean both mentioned earlier. We know it's a challenging budget year, but we also know that government always finds money for what it values. It found $1.2 billion, just 3 years ago for the Orioles and the Ravens. It found $400 million to rebuild Pimlico, as we know. And of course, as Jake in particular mentioned, right now, the most important priority, both for MTA and for Baltimore area transit riders, is funding the Be More bus plan. 80% of MTA's ridership in Baltimore is on the buses. And as was mentioned, it's a great plan, but a plan without funding has no value. To repeat, a plan without funding has no value. And as we know, Baltimore area residents, businesses, institutions rely on MTA buses 365 days a year. And it truly is long past time to value transit and the people who use it in the Baltimore region. If we really value transit, and so many of us who rely on it, funding will materialize. We know that government funds what it values. Next slide. And as you can see, a number of other states, many of our, sister states, if you will, in the Northeast Corridor, as well as across the country, have found, even in these challenging times, have found new money for transit. The Massachusetts legislature and the governor approved and made it happen. A millionaire's fair share tax, which is not only going to transit, it's going to education as well. But over the first year, they were anticipating $1.8 billion of new revenue to fund transit as well as education in Massachusetts. State of New Jersey now has a corporate transit fee. All of that money is going to New Jersey Transit, and they're projecting $1 billion of new revenue for New Jersey Transit from that fee. Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania in the past year reallocated highway funds for SEPTA in the Philadelphia region. And most recently, the state of Illinois, the legislature and the governor found $1.5 billion of new revenue for public transit in Illinois. Most of that money going to the Chicagoland region, and a lot of that money is coming from the reallocation of highway toll revenues. So if those four states, as well as others, and I know Colorado, I think Oregon is in the forefront of that as well, no reason why the state of Maryland can't do something comparable. And really, it's not about a lack of money, and we know the stories in the media and what folks have said publicly. State of Maryland is not bankrupt. The sky is not falling. It will be allocating, tens of billions of dollars, in the next budget. So the money is there, or could be there. What might be missing right now is the political will to make that money happen. What I can tell you is there is and I think many of us know this, there is a growing core of legislators, particularly from Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and even some other parts of the state that are willing to do battle, or willing to fight to have this money in the budget. They need all of us to show up, both on February 2nd and in between that date and the end of session, and articulate how important this is. A couple of slides to finish up. Jake, go ahead. And I don't think anyone has said this any better than Governor Moore himself. You cannot have economic mobility without physical mobility. And we're certainly hopeful that the governor, since he's on record as saying this multiple times now, will back that up by supporting, as he and his staff did a year ago, additional money for MTA specifically, so that MTA can move planning forward for its Be More bus plan. Next slide. Okay, so how can you guys all, everyone on this call and your networks and colleagues help? Join us on February 2nd. We need your voice, we need your presence, and we need your passion. You'll see our flyer there, and we can get PDFs to all of you. It's got a QR code to take you right to our Eventbrite page where you can sign up, not only to come to the rally, but to ride one of our free buses. We've got some grant money that is paying for buses that will be picking people up around Baltimore, taking them to the rally and back. And one thing that's also different this year from a year ago is the rallies at the end of the day. It starts at 6 o'clock. Last year, the Transit Riders Rally was at 2 o'clock. And we know a lot of people told us they wanted to be there, but either, couldn't take time off from work, if they were in school, didn't want to miss class time. So the buses will be picking people up between 3:30 and 4, getting to Annapolis between 4:30 and 5. So there'll be between an hour and a half for people coming to the rally to meet with their delegates, meet with their senators, tell their stories firsthand, and then show up at the rally. Next slide. Okay, that's our Eventbrite page. And Robin, if you can maybe get the links, in your follow-up email to the Eventbrite page, make it real easy for people to sign up that way, in addition to using the QR code. Next slide. Which is, thank you, Robin and Jimmy and Transit Choices. That's our website, bettertransitnow.org. You see a lot of additional information about the rally and why this work is so important. And if you want to reach us via email, it's advocate@bettertransitnow.org.
Thank you very much, Paul. Wonderful presentation. It's so important, that advocates, and that involves organizations, transit riders, legislators, the list goes on and on, that we come together and speak with one voice. So thank you for your presentation and thank you for joining us today. We are at the close of our meeting, and I would like to ask Jimmy Rouse, Transit Choices founder, to please provide our closing remarks.
Well, I want to thank our presenters. We're so lucky to have somebody like Sean with his knowledge and wisdom and experience at MDOT advocating for better transit. And he's not alone. There are a lot of great people at MDOT and in the MTA. And then I'm so thankful for the enthusiasm of Jake and Paul. That's what we need, enthusiasm to build the advocacy movement for better public transit. And you both of you guys are great. So thank you. And then I want to thank all the people who are tuning into these meetings, because the very act of tuning in helps us to advocate for better transit. Your presence at these meetings enables us to bring good people to the meetings to inform you what is going on, and gives you a chance to ask the questions and makes suggestions to these people. So it's a very important part of the advocacy movement to have people come in and listen to these meetings, and we appreciate the fact that you do. So thank you.
Thank you. I echo Jimmy's comments and sentiments, and please be on the lookout for information regarding the next Transit Choices meeting. But until then, we wish you a wonderful day, and thank you again for your support. Bye-bye.